welcome to yet another fabulous Linux Zoo crew. And this week on the Zoo, we have the topic Racing Penguins. We're going to be talking about Gentoo questions and answers. And today I have two special guests on the show who will be joining us. First, I have one of the developers of Gentoo, and his name is JD Hoare. And then, of course, I also have one of the contributors, and his name is Armageddon. Welcome, both of you, to the show. I also have Lixer joining us, and it's been a while since I've seen you on the show. Welcome back. He's been using Gentoo for a short period of time. And, of course, LectroLinux is sitting in the show with us. So welcome, one and all. And before I begin, I'd like to pause for a moment to share with you a few words from our founder, Voltam.
Hi, I'm Voltam, founder of the Linux Distro community. The Linux Distro community is a place for people to hang out and discuss Linux distros, software, and open source. The Linux Distro community is a community funded by its members for its members. We are a friendly, welcoming community that encourages people who use Linux operating systems and software to share their passion and knowledge with other people. We believe that when people share information freely, everyone benefits. We'd love to see you become a part of the Linux Distro community. You can voice chat with us on Mumble or text chat with us in IRC. Head over to linuxdistrocommunity.com for details. Join in today in the sharing of knowledge and the freedom that a Linux operating system gives people. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Voltam, for that. And once again, welcome, Armageddon and JD Hoare. Well, I've been using Arch Linux for quite a few months now, and I've really found it to be a wonderful operating system. It really taught me a lot about Linux. But now everybody's telling me that Gentoo is the way to go. JD, can you please tell me a little bit about Gentoo, where it came from, and what are its advantages?
Sure. Gentoo is what's considered a meta distribution, and what that means is it's a distribution that is completely designed to be effectively all things to all people. You can make it into literally whatever you want. It was originally developed by a guy named Daniel Robbins because, well, like most Linux distributions, he was unhappy with what he saw at the time, and he liked a lot of what he saw in FreeBSD, and he decided to bring a lot of what he saw in FreeBSD over to Linux, thus creating Gentoo.
Armageddon, in your words, tell me a little bit about your experiences with Gentoo.
I started using Gentoo a year ago, maybe a bit more. The first time, as I said, I tried it, it wasn't a bad timing. I had my finals, so I had to move back to Arch, and I was an Arch user for a long time. But then I felt nostalgic about Gentoo again, and I moved back a year ago, and I joined the contributor teams testing packages for stabilization to make them stable in Gentoo.
Now, Lixer's also had a little bit of experience with Gentoo, and you just actually installed this, a few weeks ago. Tell me a little bit about your experiences with that.
Yeah, I've installed it in a VM. I'm not fully ready to throw it onto the middle, but it's actually been really fun. I mean, it's very intimidating at first because it's all source and you don't really have much to start out with, but it's definitely a great experience. If you want to learn a lot about Linux and you want to go even deeper, Gentoo is definitely the way to go.
All right, now Ryan on IRC was mentioning that he would like it if the install guide were easier to find on the website. And this is just one of those distributions where, like Arch, you gotta sit down and read the documentation and go through all the steps of installing this. And I understand that pretty much when you install a Gentoo system on your computer, you're pretty much building this thing from source. Please tell us a little bit about that, JD.
Well, basically, you're building it from the ground up. You're starting with, going to a live CD, actually creating the partitions yourself, formatting them yourself, downloading what's called a stage 3 tarball that contains the core of the system, such as the compiler and the package manager and a couple of base packages like Python and Perl. And then you just extract that, and then you just start using Emerge, the package manager, to install the rest of your system, like the kernel and stuff like that.
Now, this sounds like a tedious process, so what are the advantages of actually doing something like this?
Well, it is a little bit tedious, but the advantages are that everything is completely the way you want it. Literally everything. You get to pretty much choose what version of software you want. You get to choose what options the kernel is configured with, because if, let's say, in Ubuntu, the default kernel doesn't have support for your hardware, or the default kernel, since it has support for almost everything, is a little bloated, you can make it smaller, you can make sure it supports your hardware, and you can customize programs as well. You can say, for example, I only want the transmission BitTorrent client, I only want to build the web interface, I don't want to build the GTK interface or the Qt interface, and you can do that in Gentoo.
Now, this is clearly something that's really advantageous, because as an Arch user, let's say I just want to install Arch Linux on my computer today, and I wanted to have a GNOME environment. There's no way I could have that, because Arch is rolling out the latest and greatest. And so this actually, from what you're telling me, is giving me the benefit of installing the packages that I would want to have. This is a great idea, especially if you want to have complete control over what your computer does. I really like that concept. Lectro, you had a question.
Yeah, so if you're basically having to compile everything in a merge, does that mean the programs you want to compile will be compatible with your system, otherwise it won't end up successfully compiling like in Arch?
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. I'm sorry, could you kind of phrase it a little bit?
Say some distributions will come with certain drivers that might not work with, say, your graphics card or whatever. If you're trying to install a package, it'll only compile it, and it'll compile it based on your system requirements or your system specifications. So does that mean it's more compatible to work with your system if it's compiled from source through a merge, since how most of Gentoo is based on compiling if you want to install something?
Right, it is better designed for your system.
It's not like a Debian package, sorry. You have to compile everything from source.
Right, and that offers, well, all those advantages that I mentioned earlier. And, I mean, yes, like with Debian, with the default Debian install, it installs every Xorg driver. With Gentoo, you only install the Xorg drivers that you need. Like, you only install the NVIDIA driver if you have an NVIDIA card. You don't have to install 100 different drivers. And you get the other advantage of, since you're compiling it for exactly your hardware, it actually runs quite a bit faster than Debian would, or than Arch Linux would, or pretty much any binary distribution that isn't compiled from source.
Yeah, that's what I meant, because you're compiling it for your own system. It's basically compiling everything for your system, for specifically your system.
And clearly this has a major advantage, especially if you're using some older hardware. Let's say you're using a single core computer and you need that extra little bit of push from your processor, that sort of thing. Armageddon, I wanted to ask your point of view on this, and because I know I've seen a number of videos on your channel where you're talking about portage and bringing packages into the system. Please tell me a little bit about that.
Well, the power of portage itself, as Jador said, that you can specify each use flag for each application you want, so you're shaping your system from ground up the way you want it to be. And it would be easier to, let's say if you have a problem with your webcam and you don't want support for webcam in any of your application, it is so easy to disable webcam support for every single application you have, and then recompile all the applications that have that use flag that use the webcam support, for example. If you have applications that you never use, or protocols like in Pigeon, if you have libgadoo and Zephyr, those two I've never used in my life and I wouldn't never use them. So why compile them in the application when compiling them would pull down more dependencies like the libraries they need? So in my video I show that there's a difference of 18 megabytes for Pigeon if I want to enable everything, but if you think about it, that's only one application of 18 megabytes of dependencies being pulled. And if you go through every single application and nitpick whatever you want from each application, you're gonna save a lot of space and a lot of dependencies.
Okay, and I've heard you talk a lot about use flags, so let me make sure that I've assimilated everything that you had told me clearly here. So a use flag basically is defining certain parameters for, like you had just said, for instance, the webcam. I only want my webcam to work with Goofy View, and I don't want it to work with Kden Live or any other applications. Is this what you're speaking of?
Well, again, it depends on whatever the application supports as enabling and disabling flags. For example, Kden Live does not, I don't think it has any webcam flag to enable or disable by default by the maintainers or by the coders of Kden Live. But let's say Pigeon, on the other hand, Pigeon has a use flag to have a GUI and a use flag not to have a GUI. And those two are the same package, which is Pigeon, even though in other distributions they are offered as two different packages. One is called Pigeon and the other one is called Finch. It's just one flag away of enabling or disabling. So let's assume you do not want the GUI part. You can disable that and keep the terminal part of it, or you can disable the terminal part of it and enable the GUI part, or you can enable both or disable both. But disabling both would mean that you're not going to have Pigeon.
Okay, I think I'm getting the gist of what you're speaking about there, and this sounds like this would be something that would really be advantageous. Now, I've had the opportunity to talk with both you and JD all day, and I mean, there were so many good things that we were talking about, and I really don't even know where to begin, you know, other than the fact that Gentoo sounds like this is something that I would really want to use to have a good workhorse of a multimedia station, and that's something I've always been working towards, having a really nice system for doing all my videos, audio production and editing and that sort of thing. And so I'm very intrigued by this, but also, you know, it's that, you know, it's what I hear everybody telling me, all the compiling time, all the compiling time, all the compiling time. Now, now is there an easy step-by-step guide that takes you through this process?
There is the Gentoo handbook that you can get on gentoo.org, and it's right there on the left side. It says Gentoo handbook. And that'll basically explain to you how to install, and then at the end it'll say, you know, if you want to install, you know, GNOME or XFCE or KDE or whatever, follow these guides. And it also says, you know, here's how you use flags, and here's how you use emerge, the command to use portage and install packages, and it explains pretty much how to do everything.
Elixir, tell me a little bit about your experiences with setting up Gentoo thus far, with what you've done. What have you built on top of it? What kind of desktop are you using? Give me a little bit of insight here.
Installing Gentoo is relatively, a lot of times over-exaggerated, I guess. Really installing it is just really untarring a stage 3 tarball and ch rooting into it, and then pretty much just building from ground up from there. And you know, it's very long and rigorous with the compiling, but you'll start to slowly see your system kind of take shape time. And as for what I have installed currently, I have GNOME 2 and all the default GNOME 2 applications, nothing special really.
Okay, now JD, my big question is, what would you say are the minimum system requirements for Gentoo to build this in a reasonable time frame?
Well, because Gentoo is so flexible, it actually does support packages. There is no binary package repository, but it does support binary packages. So, in theory, you could install it on, like, you know, a 200 megahertz Pentium 1. But really, I would say that the minimum requirements for a system that you're going to use, like a normal Gentoo system, is probably a 1 gigahertz CPU and 512 megabytes of RAM.
Okay, that doesn't sound too bad, but what I'm thinking about in the long term here is when you're, because I'm assuming you have to compile the entire core of the system, okay, and a computer with those requirements, I've read people talking about taking a week to install. Is that true?
That could have been true. I mean, on a 200 megahertz Pentium 1, not using any binary packages, it could take a week to compile. I haven't used a system like that in well over 10 years, so I don't really know. But, for example, I have a laptop with a 2.2 gigahertz single core Celeron, and I can do a install to a command line like what you do when you do an Arch install in about an hour and 10 minutes.
Okay, so that's not too bad. So basically what you're saying is, because there are binary packages that are available for this, you can actually build a core system and then just install binaries rather than compiling all the individual packages. I mean, does it give you choices whether you want to actually compile those packages for the system or using binaries? Does it give you a choice there?
It does not give you a choice, and like I said earlier, there is no binary repository, so either you have to have a fast system in your house where you're compiling, the packages, let's say in the CH root, and then moving them over, or there are several unofficial repositories called bin hosts, but they don't contain binary versions of every package, and they might not exactly fit your system or fit what you want. The downside to being binary is you don't get the advantages like being able to, customize everything.
Okay, fair enough. LectroLinux has a question for you.
Why is there no, obviously for obvious reasons, but people might not understand why there's no graphical user interface installer, or even just like a terminal-based installer like these in Arch? If someone just wants a base core system with just say GNOME 2 on it, just start from scratch and then use a merge and then put all the extra packages that they want. Why is it just like not the Gentoo way or something?
I mean, that's basically what it is. It's not the Gentoo way, and I mean, it kind of goes back to if you want a system that you just, pop in the live CD, double-click install on the desktop, go through the wizard, and then reboot during your full install, Gentoo really isn't the distro for you. There are Gentoo, I would call them Gentoo family distributions, one called Calculate Linux and one called Sabayon, that do offer that based on Gentoo, but they're not quite the same as Gentoo. For example, Sabayon has their own separate package manager, but it is still based on Gentoo, so, that's what you have there.
Okay, now we've discussed that there are some advantages over building this for your system. And before the show, you were making a comparison between Arch and Gentoo with that regard. Please share with us that insight.
Well, the thing is in Gentoo, you really do have choice. Like I was saying earlier, you get to choose your version, you get to choose what use flags something's compiled with, you get to choose pretty much everything. With Arch Linux, that really isn't the case. Yes, you can compile from ABS or AUR, but, that's kind of unsupported and you have to do a lot of the maintenance yourself at that point. But with Gentoo, once you set up your settings the way you like them, everything's done for you. Also, the other thing I would really like to mention about Gentoo that I personally believe is one of Gentoo's biggest selling points, it's one of the only rolling release distributions that actually has a stable version. Because, with Arch, there really isn't a real testing repository where real hardcore testing happens.
Okay, now that's funny that you mentioned that, because yes, earlier before the show started, you had mentioned that when an Arch user gets fed up with an update breaking the system, they eventually head over to Gentoo. That sort of thing. Yes, I'm still wearing a few Band-Aids from having, I'm still wearing, a few Band-Aids from when I had an update. But the thing is, I was able to go in and fix it, and it wasn't that hard to do. And what I wanted to go into was its update system on there. How do updates occur? Because this is a rolling release. In Pac-Man, we have Pac-Man SYU, and it syncs and updates the entire system. How does that work in Gentoo?
In Gentoo, it's actually two commands. first you run emerge --sync, which updates kind of the list of packages, and then you run the command emerge --update space world, and that actually, updates all your packages.
Okay. Oh, really? So it's not going to sit there and just... Now, let me ask you, is it going to go through a long process of compiling everything for you?
If there are a lot of updates, like if it's been, a month or two since you last updated, yes, it will. But I tend to pass the --ask along with that so that, it'll build a list for me and ask me, hey, do you want to install these 20 updates? And, if I don't have time, I'll say no. And, maybe I'll start doing them when I go to bed. That way, by the time I wake up in the morning to check my email before work, my system's completely up to date and I can happily check my email and stuff.
Okay, well that sounds like something that would be pretty good. But I, on the other hand, I have a production machine, and sometimes I'll usually set videos to render overnight while I'm sleeping. So at any rate, updates may take a lot longer than your average off-the-shelf Linux distribution that you're running, but you can count on stability with each update. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say that's correct. And, well, that's on the stable side. You can also run, we call it Gentoo ~arch, but you could consider it testing or unstable or whatever you like. That, for example, GNOME 3 is available in testing, and in testing, the updates are slightly more likely to break things, but it's still going to be fairly stable. I would say it's still at that point going to be a bit more stable than Arch Linux.
Okay, that sounds fair enough.
I suppose what runs in Arch's favour is obviously the amount of time it takes to update. Because obviously you're not having to compile everything on updates. It just takes a matter of seconds or minutes, whereas with Gentoo you're talking hours or minutes.
Actually, it's not as bad as hours, and it depends on what kind of applications that are getting updated. Let's assume you have Firefox update, and Firefox is offered as binary in Gentoo as well, so you can have the binary and it will install in seconds. And same for LibreOffice, same for Google Chrome, same for Opera, and those are binaries and they're offered as binaries, so they would install just instantly. And if you want to compile them, you have to wait for them to compile, and they take a long time. Depends on your CPU speed. But usually updates are not that bad. I mean, yesterday there was an update of Xorg, which is 80 packages, and that would take around an hour, but it is an 80 package. Usually there are not that many packages updated on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. I would say that an hour a week, maybe 2 hours a week would be the maximum amount of time you have to wait for compiling updates if you're not updating regularly.
Okay, so now let's say I installed LibreOffice and I just compiled it, the entire thing myself. Okay, versus, let's say I've got two identical computers, okay? And on one I've got Gentoo installed, I compiled LibreOffice myself, and then on the other computer I used a binary package. Am I going to expect a difference in performance between the one where I actually compiled it versus the one where I used a binary package?
Yes, there would be a slight difference in performance, but on something like LibreOffice, unless you're doing like really hardcore macros and like you're running, 20,000 line macros, all day, every day, you're not really going to notice a difference. The only place you would notice a significant performance difference like that is really on stuff like, rendering 3D stuff in the program like 3ds Max, or rendering out video, or doing audio editing, or stuff like that, really.
And that would be the major push for me, because I'm actually using because I'm actually using Kdenlive Live, and I'm using a number of plugins, and of course everybody knows that when you pile a bunch of effects on a video clip, you're going to expect some longer rendering time. So that would be something that would be attractive to me, that I'm actually going to build this package and use it, because I'm going to get, because I can come to expect that performance hit.
Yeah, I mean, my personal opinion is the real benefit to Gentoo is not necessarily the speed improvements it gives you, but it's really more the extreme customizability that Gentoo offers you. And I will say, I mean, that customizability can be a little bit overwhelming at first, but very quickly you get used to it and you start to understand kind of what use flags do what, and which ones you want, which ones you don't, for example.
All I can say is we need more videos on YouTube about Gentoo, because when you search for Gentoo and how to install and all that, you don't really get many useful videos. Even just showing you how to set up go through the install process, or even just telling people where to go.
I mean, the install process, like I mentioned, kind of takes about an hour, and that doesn't make for a very entertaining video, an hour of just kind of sitting there watching a kernel compiler, watching a tarball extract or something like that.
I would have to agree with that, and that's probably why we're not seeing a whole lot of coverage on YouTube, because of that reason. But the thing is, what I did in my Archbang bootcamp when I was compiling things from the AUR, I would show the command that I issued, and then I would stop the recorder and start recording again when the compilation was finished. And I would only start the recording back up again unless there was something that came up that I needed to point out to somebody during that process. And that's the way that you can get around that, because I don't think anybody's going to want to sit down and listen to you tell dirty jokes while something is compiling for about an hour. But then again, that could have a good show value as well.
Yeah, but like you do, you can always just pause the video and then resume it once it's done. You don't have to sit there through the whole install. Like when we do a distribution review on, say, Pingai or whatever, we'll say, you double click here, you go through all these steps, and then you see it copying files, and you're like, all right, I'll just pause it when it's done, and then in the blink of an eye, it's done. But we watching it didn't have to sit there and wait for it to go all the way across. I mean, fair enough, people like Toss Today and all that like to talk while it's installing, but unless you've got naught to talk about, you might as well just pause the video and resume when it's done.
Okay, so JD, you were telling me, since Gentoo does not have a binary repository to get the packages, where do you go and get them?
Well, what happens is, for example, when you run pacman SYU when you first do an install, let's assume there are no packages to update, but it downloads a tarball containing the entire database of information about all the packages in the repository. It's in a similar way, when you do emerge --sync, it actually downloads basically text files of all the e-builds for all of Gentoo, all the packages in the repository, and puts them on your system, in a similar way.
Okay, so this sounds like something that's similar to the AUR that we have in Arch Linux. So pretty much this takes the guesswork out of finding those binaries to get them installed on the system. Am I correct in that?
Sort of, yes. I actually wanted to mention something about AUR because I'm sure a lot of people who have used Arch really understand that the AUR is a great resource where you can get, all sorts of, some really mainstream like Skype and some just really odd, random packages that the community decided to put on the AUR. And the one problem, in my personal opinion, with the AUR is there's no quality control. You might be downloading, a really crappy package that's gonna, put files everywhere over your system or something like that, which is part of the reason why we don't have anything exactly like that in Gentoo. However, we do have two really interesting projects called the Proxy Maintainers Project and the Sunrise Project, and Sunrise is an overlay, which is like a third-party repository that if you make an e-build and prove that you have a clue what you're doing, you'll be allowed to upload it to there. Or the Proxy Maintainer Project, you can email your e-build to a Gentoo developer who will say, okay, you'll handle bugs and I'll handle bugs, and we'll put this in the official main repository.
I'm sitting here nodding my head in agreement with you because, yes, there is some packages in the AUR that really just do not work that well. I'll go and try and compile something, and maybe it'll say it can't compile this because the download server's wrong, or and unfortunately people just don't maintain them as well as they probably should be. But the thing is, I had been able to find a number of really good packages in the AUR. But the thing is, if there is a piece of software that I want bad enough on my Arch system, I'll actually download the tarball and compile it myself if need be.
Yeah, and of course you can do that on Gentoo as well. And even on Gentoo, the same as Arch, it's actually really easy to write your own e-builds and write your own package builds when you learn kind of the basics of the format. And, you can build packages from your own e-builds and have fun that way.
Armageddon.
I'm actually a proxy maintainer for a package that is in the tree right now. And I would like to say that another very good feature I found about Gentoo, which gets the community of Gentoo, the user community of Gentoo, closer to the development community of Gentoo, is the Bugzilla. Because in the Bugzilla, for example, let's assume that you need an application that doesn't exist and you don't know how to make an e-build. You can ask for one in there. Let's assume that you know how to make an e-build and you created an e-build and would like to share it with everyone. You can put it you can open a bug report and put it in there, and a developer will look at it and see if it has mistakes, correct them, and maybe consider putting it in the repository. You can also, if you have a problem with a sort of an e-build that's not compiling, an application that's not compiling from the repository, you can open a bug report in there and it will get fixed as soon as possible. All those kind of interactions with the developers and the developer community on IRC as well, where you can go in and ask questions to the developers themselves. I think that the whole thing when I was using Arch, I didn't find this whole community working this way. So I find Gentoo to be more homey, if you want to call it home. Like it feels like home. It feels like your own distribution where everyone is a big family helping each other.
LectroLinux.
It's more of a question for the developers. Because Gentoo, you compile everything. When you want to be a tester, do you do it on actual spare machines, or do you tend to run it in virtual machines? Because if you do something that's going to break your system, you're going to have to be spending ages finding what the problem is.
Well, the great thing about Gentoo is to be a developer, to test stuff, you don't need to run a full testing system. For example, I'm not a kernel maintainer, so I never mess with my kernel. I mess with a bunch of userland packages, and I can basically run one package from testing, my package, and have my whole system stable. That way I know no matter what I do with my package, my system's going to remain pretty stable.
But what happens if the package has been built for a newer kernel than what you run?
In that case, I would have to put in that, this requires the newer kernel, and I would have to say to myself, oh crap, I guess I have to use a newer kernel. But really, the kernel in Gentoo is pretty recent, the stable kernel, and really almost no package should require a newer kernel than you have available.
Do Gentoo developers tend to use VirtualBox, or do they tend to just run it straight on the bare metal?
A lot use virtual machines, a lot run bare metal. I mean, I have 12 systems up here in my home office, so I can always find bare metal to test something out on. But, I know a lot of developers and a lot of people don't have nearly that many machines, and a lot of them do use VMs.
Armageddon.
Actually, I do have some packages on my overlay. I have an overlay on Gentoo. What I tend to do, I don't have another machine to test my packages on, and I don't have a virtual machine to test my packages on. So what I tend to do is I tend to compile the package first, and understanding the way the e-builds work and the whole portage system, how it works, I then consider writing the e-build depending on the behavior of the configuration and compilation of the package before trying to make an e-build. And then after I do an e-build, because there's a way of work in portage, it compiles and installs everything inside of a closed sandbox, and then it moves the files to the actual system. What I can do is I can test it up to that point before actually installing on my system and break the whole installation at that point to see if everything goes okay before moving forward to the next step.
Now, Edward went on to ask you, Armageddon, do you use Git for versioning?
On my overlay, yes.
Okay, this has all been very, very interesting. It's given me so much food for thought here because I am understandably curious about using Gentoo and giving it a try on my computer here, especially for having a nice multimedia setup that I can use for putting together my shows and everything. And once I'm ready to take that step, of course, everybody is going to be seeing videos on YouTube about my experiences with this once I'm ready to get started on it. I would like to take this time to thank both JD and Armageddon for joining me on the show today. You've been very insightful and you've helped me develop a better understanding of how Gentoo works and the advantages of using it. I'd also like to thank Lixer and LectroLinux for joining us as well. I really appreciate you guys stepping up to the plate, and you've asked a lot of really good questions, Electro, that I couldn't think of asking, so I really appreciate that. And I'd also like to thank everybody who's been participating on IRC in our listening room. As always, it's always good to have you here and seeing your comments every week, and we're going to be back next week with another show. We're supposed to have a surprise guest, but I'm going to leave that for later. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for listening, and we will see you next week, same time, same channel.
Today's show was brought to you by the Linux Distro Community. Visit us today at linuxdistrocommunity.com and chat with us on Mumble or in IRC on the Freenode network in the Linux Distro Community channel. The Linux Distro Community. Freedom through the sharing of knowledge.